This is a basic running stitch. So the way that this works is you do one stitch. So this is our first stitch, and this is actually our second stitch. And here's our third and fourth stitches. And the cool thing about running stitch is you can actually do several at a time. Like this. So this can be really fast. The downside of using this stitch is that it isn't always as stable. So even if let's see, I've worked about an inch here, so I'm going to go ahead and knot this off. Oops. There we go. So you can see I've got about an inch of running stitch here. See how when I stretch this fabric, you can kind of see some of my stitching? And part of that is because this is contrasting thread. If the thread were black or burgundy, you probably wouldn't see it so much. But it isn't quite as stable as backstitch. It's good if you just want to throw together a seam that isn't going to have a lot of stress on it. So backstitch is different in a couple of ways. We're going to start this like we would start any project. Do our one little stitch, catch the loop. So backstitch has a distinct wrong side and right side. Because this has our knot in it, this will be the back side of our work. If you're doing like a seam on pants on the inside, like a side seam, or you're doing the side seam of a shirt, it doesn't really matter which side is the right side and the wrong side. But if you're top stitching a pocket or a patch or something in place, you want to make sure that the back side of your stitch is on the back side of your garment. So I'll show you that as well. The first thing we're going to do is insert our needle into the right side of our work. I'm giving myself one stitch length here. And this is why this is called backstitch. So if I was doing running stitch, I would just continue forward. But unlike running stitch, I'm going to go back into my first stitch that I made, or as close as I can get. Okay, and this is where things are on the wrong side of my work. So that's my first stitch. To make my second stitch, I'm going to insert my needle just about the same length. So this is second stitch. And then again, back into the end of the last stitch I made. So one stitch length away, and then back into the end of my last stitch. These are pretty wide stitches. You probably want to do half this width, or half this stitch length if you're actually doing this on a side seam of pants. But you can also see on the back there's a lot of overlap. So let me do those closer together. Generally when you're doing stitches, you want to make sure that they're about even width apart. And you can also see I'm pulling the fabric to make sure that it doesn't get bunched up. Okay, make sure that my thread stays even. Back into the last stitch. And back into the last stitch. I'm sort of doing two steps in one here. I'm putting my needle into the back end of the last stitch and also creating my next stitch here. So our thread is getting pretty short. I'm going to knot this so I can cut my thread and make some new thread. So you want to flip over to your back side like I just did and knot your thread. Ooh, sometimes that method can get a little tricky if your needle's long and your thread has gotten real short. Okay, and I'm going to bury my thread. You want to make sure, just on that note, that your working thread, you don't allow it to get shorter than your needle, because then it becomes really difficult to stitch. I got really close there. So say you wanted to do a back stitch with the right side of the stitch visible on the outside. For example, if this was the side seam of a pair of pants and you just wanted to make sure that this seam stayed extra flat without ever having to iron it, you could do that here. So you want to start on your back side just like you would any other stitch. I wouldn't necessarily catch the outside of your fabric here, but do catch that loop like we've talked about before, and then insert your needle. Actually, let's go a stitch length away. Then turn your work over to your right side. And the trick to making this look good is to make sure you try to stay a uniform width away from your side seam or whatever seam you're stitching next to, and you try to make sure your stitches are about equal in width or length. So something that I do to help me keep a uniform distance away from the side seam is choose a point on my thumb. So right here where my nail meets my skin to join it. I'm kind of using that as my marker to line it up with the seam, and then I know that where my thumb is from there is about how far away from that side seam I want to go. So as you can see, you're doing the same stitch. The only thing that you want to make sure of is that your right side of the stitch is on the outside, the part that's visible, and your wrong side that overlaps is on the inside. Okay, so instead of putting my needle all the way through, this time I'm just going to put it back into that last stitch, flip it over, and then form my knot. I'm not putting my needle through all the way to the outside, being careful not to catch the outside because I don't want my knot to show up there. Okay, so I'm going to wrap my thread around my needle, pinch what will be my knot very close to the fabric. Okay, now that I've got my knot, I can turn back over to the right side of my work. And then I just continue doing my back stitch as I was doing it. So here we're going to look at a practical example of what ladder stitch or invisible stitch looks like. I am mending a shirt that belongs to my partner. The stitching has come out right at the collar, so the collar and the body of the shirt have begun to separate, and this is easily mended with a ladder stitch. So just like any other project, I'm gonna start my thread in the back, going through only one layer so my thread isn't seen on the outside, And it's extra important to make sure you catch that loop on knitted fabrics because they stretch, and when they stretch, the holes get bigger. So it's more likely that your knot will slip through your fabric if you don't catch that loop in the back. So after you've caught your loop, you want to flip your project over to the right side and insert your needle into one side of your project. And then I'm going to start making my stitches look like the rungs of a ladder, going back and forth. I'm just catching the folded edge of the body of the shirt. Now, like my other examples, I'm using thread here that's much darker than what I would usually use. Usually I would probably match my thread to the gray collar, but I wanted you to see what I'm doing, first of all, and second of all, this is a great example of how ladder stitch is truly invisible when it's done. Once I tighten and knot this, you shouldn't be able to see the thread at all, even though it's a really dark contrasting color. So I'm leaving my threads loose as I work, just so I can make sure that they're parallel. And as you can see, as we continue to stitch, the stitches look more and more like the rungs of a ladder, which is why it's called a ladder stitch. Okay, so we're almost at the end here, where the stitches made at the factory are still holding the collar to the shirt. I'm going to do one last stitch and tighten my thread up. And then I'm going to make sure, especially since this is a knit fabric, that I stretch my fabric a little bit, just to make sure that I don't stop the stretch of this fabric. It's especially important on the collar here because that's what allows you to get the shirt over your head. So I've poked my needle through so that my thread is now in the back, and I'm going to knot off my work. Sorry, I got a little out of frame there, but I am just inserting my needle into the same spot a few times and then knotting it. And again, like any project, you want to make sure that you bury your thread. You don't want to cut your thread too close to where you knotted it, because that gives the knot an opportunity to come undone. So burying your thread helps hide the tail end of your thread at the end of your stitch, and it also protects the integrity of your knot. So you can see it's pretty invisible on the outside, true to its name. I'm going to go ahead and bury my thread in between the two layers of the collar here.